the women were systematically gang raped, the men were tied up, tortured, and then shot and buried in shallow graves, and the children were kidnapped. That's what Ukraine has to look forward to if they surrender.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Sir Bill Browder on the show. We've spoken about these further negotiations happening today between the US, Russia, the US and Ukraine. So whether it's going to be making real progress the way that Steve Witkoff says. We've also spoken about that interview with Steve Witkoff and Tucker Carlson. He said he doesn't regard Putin as a bad guy. So we've got some first-hand reaction from Bill Browder, who has experience with Putin. So of course he believes he is a bad guy. So we spoke to him all about that, and of course whether negotiations will lead to a peace deal. Look, Bill is incredibly pessimistic about that. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube. Sir Bill Browder, thank you for joining the Trump Report today. Today, negotiations will begin again. We've got Steve Witkoff. He's meeting with both Russian and Ukrainian counterparts. All the Trump administration members that they've put up will meet with both counterparts today. Ukraine and Russia, of course, will not be in the same room as we would expect, but discussions today will kind of center around ceasefires when it comes to the Black Sea, as well as more deals in place for how we can end this war. Now, Steve Witkoff says that he thinks that real progress will be made today, but is that your understanding? Do you think that will happen, or it will kind of be a wish-washy situation as it has been?
Well, let's just look at the facts. About 10 days ago, Ukraine agreed to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. The ball was then put in Putin's court, and he did not agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. He offered some kind of vague, very narrow ceasefire involving energy infrastructure, mainly because he cannot tolerate the destruction of his own oil refineries, which the Ukrainians have now been very successful at doing with their drones. And so it's to his advantage to have a ceasefire on energy infrastructure. But at the same time as he's demanding ceasefires on energy infrastructure so his own oil refineries don't burn up, they're bombing Ukrainian civilians in Kiev, Odessa, and every other place. And so it seems like a big nonsense to be even talking about a ceasefire when Putin continues to kill Ukrainians. And by the way, while Putin was on the phone with Trump talking about this very narrow energy ceasefire, 57 minutes later, they bombed a Ukrainian energy installation. So I don't believe that Putin is sincere in any way, shape, or form. I think he's doing what I call the KGB rope-a-dope. He's just sort of putting stuff out there and giving a little and taking a little, but not really doing anything. And his objective has nothing to do with Ukraine. He just wants to normalize relations with the United States and do whatever he can to lift sanctions.
It was interesting because there is that report, Bill, as you mentioned, that Russia is using drones to actually target Ukrainian civilians. So yeah, it's a bloody war. And last week we did have this 30-day ceasefire from both sides. They weren't allowed to target each other's energy and infrastructure, as you said. Now, the Trump administration labeled this a huge success in this fight for a peace deal to eventually be brokered. But as you said, almost immediately, both sides apparently broke the deal. Ukraine said that Russia targeted them with 150 drone strikes. So when you read this news last week, did you consider it a huge success like the Trump administration said?
Not at all. I think that this was a humiliation. Trump touted the idea that he got Ukraine to agree to ceasefire, and then Putin. First of all, Putin joined the call with Trump an hour late. He had a more important conference with a bunch of Russian businessmen at the in central Moscow, and so he delayed the most powerful man in the free world for an hour, and then he didn't agree to what Trump asked for. I think it was a humiliation of Trump, not a success in any way, shape, or form.
Let's get into this interview with Tucker Carlson and Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East Special Envoy. Now, this is a pretty interesting interview, Bill, and I'm sure the comments of it have made your blood boil. Now, he said that in an interview with Tucker, he said he liked Putin. He said that he doesn't regard Vladimir Putin as a bad guy. He says he's super smart and he doesn't see that he wants to take all of Europe. What was your response to that?
Yeah, I listened to the interview twice, and as you mentioned, it did make my blood boil. It's as if this guy was he's 68 years old, and it's as if he was born yesterday. So first of all, did he not see the the hundreds of thousands of casualties in Ukraine, innocent civilians that have been killed? Does he not know about Alexei Navalny, Boris Nemtsov, Sergei Magnitsky, Anna Politkovskaya, all these people who have been assassinated by Putin? Novichok, Polonium 210. I mean, it's just remarkable. I mean, where has this? What has he just been living under a rock? Putin is objectively a bad guy. 92% of Americans think Putin is a bad guy, and so either this guy, Steve Witkoff, has just doesn't has the most ignorant person ever, or it's one of the most cynical things I've ever seen on a media source to have the person supposed to be advising or mediating a war saying those types of things.
Bill, I know that you're not one to get super personal in these interviews, but you are someone that has been personally attacked by Vladimir Putin, and you've watched your former Russian lawyer be thrown in jail for even if it was for a crime that wasn't a crime, and tortured and tragically killed. And you've obviously written a book on it. So when you see a member of Trump's very exclusive team of negotiators saying comments like that, do you think it's incredibly damaging on the world stage for Americans, for countries that are part of NATO, for world leaders to look at this guy and think, wow, that is the person holding one of the most pivotal positions right now in ending this war?
Well, so I've been at odds with Putin for nearly 20 years now, and I've been on a major campaign. I've given up my life as a businessman to try to contain Putin, to try to sanction Putin, to try to get countries to get tough on Putin. And in this campaign for a very long time, my most stalwart ally has been the United States of America. The U.S. was always first to do something. The U.S. was the first to do the Magnitsky Act. It took the U.K. 8 years after after the U.S. did the Magnitsky Act before they did the Magnitsky Act. And just for all the viewers, the Magnitsky Act is legislation named after my lawyer, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of Russian human rights violators and kleptocrats. Um, so the U.S. has always been first up, the most stalwart, the morally clearest in this whole fight for justice, this black and white situation. And then to have that ally, my most stalwart ally, flip. They've gone from being against the evil Russian Putin regime to being for that regime. It's kind of hard to process. It's heartbreaking, really.
I know that we go back and forth on this flip, but is there any rhyme or reason why there was this massive flip from the White House?
Well, I spent a lot of time being asked that question. Everyone wants to know what's the reason. The one thing I can say is that when it's not irrational. When it looks irrational, but it's not. And the reason it's not irrational, everybody behaves rationally at this level. This is not some type of these are not children here. These are experienced people who are behaving rationally, but they're behaving rationally based on information we don't know. So what is it that's there that's causing Trump to have flipped to go from to support Putin? And is he getting something? What is he getting? And that's what I don't know. I don't know what's behind the scenes? What if we lift up the hood? Is it compromise? Is it money? Is it that he just likes bad guys? I don't know. But what we do know is that he has flipped, and it doesn't really matter what's caused him to flip. All that matters at this point, and by the way, let's just say it was something illegal that caused him to flip. He is immune from prosecution based on the a Supreme Court judgment that says that anything the president does in his official capacity can't be prosecuted. So he's safe, whatever it is, from prosecution. But we have to deal with the fallout, whatever that may be. And the fallout is hard to even quantify now. I mean, we're just at the beginning of this process. You know, what can and probably will happen is going to completely change the world, and we're just at the beginning of it.
What I wonder in this language, in this complimentary rhetoric from Steve Witkoff, from Donald Trump, from whoever's working in the team that come out and basically use such positive compliments, positive language, positive analogies about Vladimir Putin. I wonder if they have a psychologist working with them, Bill, who is kind of advising them on the way that they should publicly speak to and about Putin in terms of trying to get a deal over the line, whether this psychologist is advising them that the only way you'll get the respect, you'll get the time with this narcissist, with this egomaniac, is by speaking about him in this way.
Well, I suspect they have a psychologist that's trying to explain to them how they can change U.S. public opinion to get this to justify switching sides. U.S. public opinion is dramatically against Putin, and in order to change U.S. public opinion, they need to start repeating over and over again that Putin is a good guy, and if they do that, perhaps they'll be able to change U.S. public opinion. You remember there was the January 6th riots and storming of the Capitol, and somehow by Trump repeating over and over again that this was about love and free speech as opposed to violence. There's now a lot of Americans that believe that. And I believe that it's the same type of thing that they're trying to do right now.
And it will be a harder task to get people to understand that, but it is still mind-boggling. And in the amount of times I've asked you, the amount of times I've asked any expert guest about the way that he's speaking, no one can kind of give a clear answer because I think everyone is so confused in the moment. But keeping on with this interview, Bill, this Tucker Carlson interview, this is what Steve Witkoff told Tucker. He said, Putin told me a story about when the president was shot. Obviously, this is July last year. He went to his local church, met with his priest, and prayed for the president. Not because he could become the president of the United States, but because he has a friendship with him and he was praying for his friend. Now, I'm just kind of in the mindset, Bill, is Vladimir Putin just absolutely taking these people for a ride and they're completely falling for it?
Well, first of all, we don't even know if that happened. I mean, we don't even know if that conversation. First of all, we don't know if Putin did that. Secondly, we don't know if that conversation actually took place. I mean, this is all. I mean, these people are truth doesn't seem to factor into anything that Vladimir Putin says or does, and it certainly doesn't factor into anything that Donald Trump says or does. And Steve Witkoff is an agent of Donald Trump, and so. I mean, it's all sort of kabuki theater. I wouldn't spend any time trying to analyze the actual words, but just look at the intentions. I mean, it's really quite something to hear this story about how Putin was praying for Trump. Yeah, he probably was praying for Trump because he knew that Trump was going to do this. And he was going to switch sides, and no other American politician from any party, Republicans or Democrats, would have done that.
I mean, yeah, it's plain as day what he meant. But okay, this interview with Tucker Carlson and Steve Witkoff, I mean, there was always cause for concern about Steve Witkoff being appointed to this role as a special envoy to the Middle East when he's currently just pretty much focusing on Russia, Ukraine, primarily Russia. Now, for anyone kind of trying to figure out who the hell is Steve Witkoff, he is Trump's big deal maker, but he has absolutely no experience in politics, in military, in international affairs. He's a guy that's had a very successful career in real estate. Now, I'm wondering, Bill, is this guy just too inexperienced for this job?
Well, he seemed to be pretty inexperienced. He couldn't name the oblasts of Ukraine, which had been occupied by Russia. Um, he had some kind of strange narrative that all the people in the occupied territory speak Russian and therefore want to be occupied by Russia. Um, he uh, I mean, he didn't know the basic facts, and of course those basic facts can be learned in a in a week if you really wanted to learn them. And so I don't know. I mean, it's not as if you have to be a 25-year veteran to go in and conduct this negotiation, but you do need to know the basic facts, and the fact that he didn't is pretty concerning. But I mean, the whole thing is concerning. The fact that you've got America basically browbeating Zelensky, publicly humiliating him, cutting off military aid, cutting off intelligence aid, uh, talking about how we want to be friends with Russia, talking about lifting sanctions against Russia. The whole thing is concerning. It's concerning in the most fundamental way, and I think that um, everyone in America should be concerned, and everyone here in this part of the world needs to be concerned because this is as this thing continues to play itself out, it's going to have really very negative consequences for us.
Negative consequences on yeah, any surrounding areas. And Putin has blatantly said that he would be wanting to occupy more areas of Europe. Of course, Poland would be the next hit. So it is very bizarre that you wouldn't believe a dictator when they're telling you what their plan is. So for Steve Witkoff to say that he doesn't believe that he wants to take any more of Europe is kind of bizarre in itself. But Bill, we've spoken about this coalition of the willing, which is of course members of the EU, the UK, pretty much run by France, by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, where they want to keep funneling money and aid into Ukraine so that they can continue fighting this war. But of course, mostly to be able to give them that security and protection of boots on the ground once the ceasefire is done. I mean, they were basically just following on from what Donald Trump had been saying, that the EU needs to step up. So for Steve Witkoff to say in this interview, he said, on the coalition of the willing, he said, I think it's a combination of a posture and a pose, and a combination of also being simplistic. There is this sort of notion that we all have to got to be like Winston Churchill. Russians are going to march across Europe. That it's preposterous, by the way. We have something called NATO, and we did not have that in World War II. Now, to throw NATO in the mix, to say we've got NATO, so there is no point for the coalition of the willing, is kind of contradictory, because the United States has basically backed away from NATO. They haven't included NATO in a number of these early negotiations, and they urged the EU and the UK to step up. So I'm kind of concerned and confused as to what this would mean to say, well, the coalition of the willing is a posture and a pose. What was your response when you read that news yesterday or today?
Well, it's completely disingenuous. Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary, basically said that if there is a peace negotiation and there's a peace treaty, then Europe would have to put people on the ground. And I think that and went on to say America wouldn't put people on the ground. And of course, we've also heard Donald Trump say very clearly that he's not happy with NATO and he may not come in to protect NATO allies. And so. I mean, it's all very strange mixed messages. Maybe he didn't know what he was talking about. Maybe it's hard to even imagine, like, is there anyone who's like sitting there sort of coordinating the party line? I don't think so. It's just guys spitballing, freewheeling, saying whatever they feel like saying. Um, and some of it contradicts the other people, and this is the chaos of the of the Trump presidency.
Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, Bill, he was asked whether the US would accept a peace deal with Russia if it meant that Russia got to keep that 20% of occupied Ukrainian land. He replied that he basically said, we have to ask ourselves, is it in our national interest? Is it realistic? Are we going to drive every Russian off of every inch of Ukrainian soil? Now, this is one of the big parts of this peace deal, because Zelensky's obviously not going to accept a deal where he has to give off 20% of his land. And it seems as if Putin won't give up that 20% of land. So how does a deal get done when it comes to this? And it's just so frustrating, because if Trump gets so frustrated with a deal not being done, I feel like he might just take a side. And it might be with Russia, where he said the only way we can get a deal done is basically we're going to have to give up this land. Sorry, Zelensky. Sorry, Ukraine. Is that your understanding of what might happen in that situation when it comes to that 20% of land?
Well, first of all, I don't think a deal is going to get done. I don't think there's any chance that a deal gets done. I think that we'll be here a year from now having a conversation about about the war between Russia and Ukraine. I don't think that there's any chance that Putin. The important thing to understand is that Putin hasn't altered his maximalist objectives. He doesn't want just 20% of the land. He wants everything. He doesn't want any peacekeepers of any nationality on Ukrainian soil. He doesn't want Ukraine to continue to have a military. And he's stated all these things. He laid them out perfectly clearly from the beginning of the war, and his position hasn't altered by an inch. And so to think that he would be happy if he just got 20% of the land and that would be the end of the war, that's not going to happen. That's just so far away from his own expectations. And so whether Zelensky would or wouldn't give up 20% of the land is kind of irrelevant. What Putin wants is everything. And so Putin is not going to get everything he wants. And the Ukrainians aren't going to surrender. And the Europeans aren't going to allow Russia to occupy Ukraine to then carry on pushing towards Europe, which is what Putin intends to do. And therefore, the war is not going to be over. That's just as simple as that.
Is the only way that you see the war being over, Bill, is by the US, by the EU, by the UK, giving more military aid to Ukraine, giving them more support so that they can win this war on their own. They can push Russia out.
Well, the basic thing is that Putin has invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is defending themselves. Putin, at any moment in time, if he wanted to, can end this war by stopping the invasion. He could stop. He could just be done with it. It's completely and solely within his power and his discretion to do that. He doesn't want to stop it. And so the only way to stop this war is to put him in a position where he has to stop it. And the only way that that can happen is with military force. And as much as everybody says this war is terrible and we don't like war, of course we don't like war. But Putin's the one who's doing the war. It's not, the Ukrainians are just defending themselves. And as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, they understand what happens when Russia occupies their country. And we've seen absolutely clear images of that in Bucha. You remember Bucha? This was where Russia occupied a town outside of Kiev. And when this dust had settled and they had been expelled from Bucha, we got to see what happened there. And what happened there was the women were systematically gang raped. The men were tied up, tortured, and then shot and buried in shallow graves, and the children were kidnapped. That's what Ukraine has to look forward to if they surrender. And therefore, no matter how tired they are of war, they would rather fight a war than face that unbelievable, hellish prospect of the women being raped, the men killed, and the children kidnapped.
So it is important that every NATO country, Bill, continues to supporting Ukraine as opposed to giving up these insane concessions that Russians are asking from them, or these insane conditions that just seem like a time filler of pushing the US around. And it's kind of strange to me that Donald Trump is continuing to believe that Putin is negotiating when really I think he's just playing with his head.
Yeah, what you have here is not a negotiation about the war. This is a series of meetings to normalize relations between Putin and the United States, and I think Putin is being very successful at it. And we're all sort of sitting here watching a sort of reality TV show where the reality is that Putin is coming in from the cold, and he's going to get all sorts of unbelievable gifts for doing nothing other than carrying on his murderous genocidal invasion of Ukraine.
Well, we'll be waiting for those discussions today, Bill, to see if they reach real progress, to say that Steve Witkoff says. So thank you for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.